This time around, shaping higher education and creating a culture of transformation. And to help us with that, Mark Milliron joins us. He is co-founder and chief learning officer of Civitas Learning, also executive director of the Next Generation Leadership Academy. And Jeff Selingo, too, is a contributor, among other things, to the Washington Post. He's written at least 3 books, which is 2 more than I've read, so congratulations on that. And New York Times bestseller. Do you get anything for being in New York Times? No, you don't. They just say, congratulations, you're a New York Times.
I guess it ends up as the first line of your obituary someday.
Right? But a lot of those scribings, obviously, about education, and we will have a conversation about that, too. We've also asked Dennis Young from Inter Architects to join us, too, as he plots a lot of academic pathways, and it seems to fit into the conversation. So, Dennis, thank you for joining us.
Thanks.
Also, gentlemen, thank you for being here. So how's this going so far? Are you enjoying the conference? Learning things?
Conference has been great.
Yeah?
No, this is one of the greatest conferences when you think about the future of higher ed, right? You have to plan for it somewhere, right?
Right, but, and they do this every year. A lot of things need a tune-up every 5 years, every 10 years. This is an annual event. Do you guys find year to year a bunch of different things pop up that need updating?
I think for this conference in particular, over the last 2 or 3 years, I think SCUP has begun to embrace this concept of integrated planning, which has been the coming together of technology planning, financial planning, academic planning, and facilities planning. I think for decades they were the preeminent place for facilities planning and kind of operational planning. But the coming together of those streams in many ways is part and parcel of the transformation work in higher education. I mean, for a number of years, people were running with really aggressive, interesting tech plans, almost in segregation from what they were doing with facilities. And I think SCUP was one of the leaders that's saying, we've got to bring those worlds together. And I think this conference, this year has probably been the loudest and proudest I've heard that from the stage, yeah. But it clearly has been part of the conversation for the last couple of years. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, no, it's been great. I think, again, higher education is coming together in so many ways around alliances for the future, because I think that the challenges facing higher education today cannot be solved by one product, cannot be solved by one area of campus, right. Whether it's technology or student affairs or academic affairs, and for most part, it cannot be solved by single institutions, right? So I'm pretty confident that not only the integrated planning model, but the integrated model overall is really going to be the future of higher ed.
Yeah.
As you write about higher education on a regular basis, do you find yourself, 2 things. Do you find yourself, Jeff, writing something that you never thought you would be writing about higher education? And do you often find yourself saying, I've been writing the same thing for 20 years now?
Well, unfortunately, Beverly Tatum last night in our plenary session said, we don't know enough about history, and so we tend to repeat it. That's on the national level, and I think the same thing is true in higher ed. I've become kind of an historian now of higher ed in the last couple of years, kind of fascinated by the system that we've created, particularly here in the U.S., and how it came to be. And in reading that history, it's amazing to me how some of the same debates that we're having today, for example, over whether it's student success or especially the debate over, are we training people for a job or are we giving them a broad education, are debates that we've had for generations, and centuries in some cases. Right. So it really worries me. We lost Bill Bowen last year, kind of a real historian of higher education who was a president. And one of the things that I note about many college presidents today, unlike the Clark Kerrs of the world and the Bill Bowens of the world and the Ted Hesbergs of the world, the giants of college presidents decades ago, many college presidents don't know much about higher education as an industry or its history. And I think that's really worrisome as we think about what we need to do to combat the challenges of the next 20 years.
Yeah, I think in our Next Generation Leadership Program, I know in the leadership program that you work with, Jeff, the conversation around the history of education is absolutely a foundation for transformation work and getting rising leaders to understand that anybody who says American higher education doesn't change much hasn't read history. And if you look back at the last 150 years and just everything from, the rise of universal high schools, junior colleges, technical colleges, integrated community colleges, the GI Bill, and even the rise of for-profit institutions and online and the rest, there's been just a sea of change in the world of higher education. But they have to understand that trajectory and kind of get where this fits in the mix. Otherwise, you end up with what happened with MOOCs a few years ago, where everybody said, well, this is something new. And it's like, no, actually, this was, online learning was innovative in 1997, right? So suddenly everyone got excited about MOOCs, and it was like, that's really not a new thing. It's just the fact that some of the elites are doing it now, so that's where we're suddenly having a different conversation.
So what do you see as the pace of change? Because business is driving a lot of that change, looking for new skill sets. How do you see those pathways accelerating? How do you see the convergence of technology, which when you go to school as a freshman and you graduate as a senior, you're going to be using different technology. So how does higher ed keep up with that?
I think the pace of change has definitely quickened in terms of the last couple of years in higher education. I always think, especially around teaching and learning, there is more attention, time, and energy and money given today on college campuses than there was 5 years ago to teaching and learning. But it's not fast enough, right? The churn of knowledge today in the economy and the world is faster than ever before, right? New human knowledge is being created basically every moment that we live. IBM predicts that, new knowledge will come up because of the Internet of Things every 11 hours in a couple of years, right? So the churn of knowledge is moving ever so faster. And at the other hand, you have colleges and universities still, I think, moving way too slowly. So much faster than it was 10 years ago, but definitely not fast enough.
Right. Yeah. And I do think that the combination of lots of external pressure around, we're moving to a culture now where 30 years ago, 40 years ago, we only needed some people to be educated at the highest levels, or at least at post-secondary levels. And now we're at a place where in the last 10, 15 years, the conversation is pretty clear. We need most people to be at least some kind of post-secondary credential with labor market value. Right. And that's a different thing. And I think because of that, we suddenly, that combined with the kind of ever-present war between the only flexible cost in public budgets, which are health costs and education costs, have led to a real conversation around what are we getting for the resources we're spending, especially on education in public institutions. And so I think now people are looking at, persistence rates and graduation rates like never before. And as we said in the keynote this morning, we really had our healthcare moment a few years ago, and the thing in healthcare that really kind of blew the conversation up was when they found out the number 3 killer of people in the U.S. turned out to be medical errors, right? And they suddenly had to just really kind of look at what was happening. Our moment was probably 8 or 9 years ago when the realization was only about half the people who start are finishing. And it's completely disparate based on income. The top income quartile is 8 times more likely to graduate than the bottom income quartile. And that has set off a whole host of innovations around how do we change that trajectory? How do we help more people start what they finish? And I think we're in a moment now where the conversation is how do we help most people who start finish and finish at a high level where they learn well and finish strong. And I think some of the work that Jeff does in particular is not only do they finish, but what do they learn when they've finished, right? And how does that actually take them with them? And so that's part of this kind of transformation conversation.
Well, what are the resources and where do you find them as a college when you want to create change and you want to do it rapidly? Obviously, you two guys can jump in and help. Is SCUP's role positioned well where they can jump in and help universities affect change?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think so. I think there are there are growing numbers of tribes within higher ed. I think the associations, unfortunately, don't always necessarily move as quickly as they need to move to react to what's happening in higher ed. But I see, I mentioned earlier, alliances growing up, right? We see things like the University Innovation Alliance, right? We see the American Talent Initiative. We see things like Unizin, right? We see these other alliances where university officials are saying, hey, we all face this common problem, right? We may not have a lot in common. We may not have similar missions. We may not be in the same state. We may not be in the same athletic conference, which historically has been why colleges and universities have gotten together to do things. Now they're starting to say, we all face this common problem, whether it's financial aid, whether it's student success with low-income students, whether it's admissions, whatever it might be. how do we fix that problem and come together? So I see that happening more often. I see the programs like Mark is doing and the program that I'm doing at Arizona State and Georgetown, the Academy for Innovative Higher Education Leaders, where people want to create networks to help themselves, right? And I think the associations can help facilitate that, but sometimes, unfortunately, I think the associations move as fast as their slowest member, right? And so I think sometimes you need to go outside of the traditional associations to move change ahead.
I think there's a real danger in best practicism where people get a number of one-size-fits-all solutions.
Right.
And people come and they say, here are the 5 things you have to do to fix retention. And it unfortunately, I think it causes people to end up latching on to a bunch of different initiatives. And I think our field, just because of lack of resources, lack of time, is almost in a moment of initiative fatigue, where people really want to get a lot of work done. I always encourage people to read. There's a book called Faster, Higher, Stronger by Mark McCluskey that is all about elite athletes. So I said it's not about education, but boy, is it about education, because it talks about why the most elite athletes are better than the athlete next to them. And there's a chapter in that book called The N of One. And the greatest part about that chapter is it talks about this idea that every one of these athletes at an early age is identified as being special, and they're scaffolded by people who are coming, trainers and parents and coaches, telling them what to do, guiding them on their direction. And that all those resources are informational and directional and important. And boy, if they're the right ones, they really help that athlete grow. At some point, the most elite athletes understand that they're an N of one. And that information is directional and important, but they have to test it on themselves. They literally, that training program might work for somebody else, but I broke my ankle when I was 12, and I'm not going to be able to do it the same way. That dietary program might work for somebody else, but I have Crohn's. So I'm not, if I'm Larry Nance Jr. on the Lakers, I can't use that program. And I think that's where we are in higher education now, where it's the realization that these alliances, these associations are producing really important and directional and important information, but institutions themselves have to turn their own lights on, and they have to develop this try and test mentality to figure out what's going to work for them. Where should they start? And then anything they do kind of test to see how it's working. And most importantly, get those data to the student. And let the student actually have some of that information so they can participate in guiding, because we want that agency to start rising where, second, third, fourth, fifth generation students are heavily scaffolded by their friends and family and parents. First generation students, which are the biggest bulk right now, they're not scaffolded in the same way. If we can get them some data that tells them what their next step should look like, we can get some real kind of interesting innovations happening.
As we're discussing shaping higher education, I wonder how much of it now, because of the workforce and people who had planned on retirement and retired and need to go back to work out of necessity, are going back and learning a new trade and going back to college and being educated in their 40s, in their 50s. Yeah. Is there a lot of that?
Well, there's going to be more of it, right?
Yeah,
this idea of we're going to have to renew our learning on a regular basis for the rest of our lives. It's just the fact of the matter today of society. And unfortunately, and I mentioned this last night in the plenary session, unfortunately, we think of education as educating kids, young people, right, young adults, right. We think of education as something that happens between 5 and 25, right. And our systems are not really set up for the fact that we still call adult students non-traditional students, even though there's such a huge number, is shocking, student. Right? Right. And so we now have, we have this need, but we don't have a system that's in sync with that need, which is why you see kind of this whole new learning economy growing up outside of traditional higher ed, right? You have things like the MOOCs, and you have LinkedIn Learning, and the old lynda.com, right? You have all, you have all the boot camps, you have all this stuff kind of growing up outside of traditional higher ed, because they're serving that market for just-in-time education for when you need it. And we're going to need that for the rest of our lives. The number one, search on Google and on YouTube is how to do something.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
People have this thirst for learning in the moment, in time, no matter what it is. They have to fix something in their house, or they have to learn how to do something new for work. And our traditional education system is not set up to do that. It's not set up to address that.
I mean, two parts of it. I mean, one is not only we have a whole wave of non-traditional learners who are coming our way, and our policy conversations are still heavily dominated by the 18 to 22-year-old living on campus going full-time student. And we do things like we don't back summer Pell, we don't do things that are really smart to try to get better part-time enrollment and also different kinds of credentialing, things that would really help the working adult. But lifelong learning used to be a trite saying, now it's a true saying, right? Yeah. People are actually doing it. And I think, Jeff, you're right. There is so much to learn from the world of workplace learning, workforce learning. When you go to, the Association for Training and Development conferences, which are gigantic, you realize that world is a lot bigger than ours. And there's a lot of innovation happening in that world. And and we should probably be having a lot more regional education ecosystem conversations, because the majority of people aren't the top 3-5% that are competing nationally for these elite schools. Most of them stay in their regions, and they're a part of this education ecosystem that's working between private and public institutions and training programs and regular universities and community colleges. And understanding those regional ecosystems is probably as or more important than any of the kind of tactical, kind of first swing kind of education programs we're putting together.